Welcome to A Plus News. Today we are joined by Neil Burgess from Bendigo Bank Agribusiness. We've got lots to cover, Neil, so let's jump straight into it. Let's start with a wrap on the current state of play for Australia's cattle and sheep markets. How's it looking?
Good morning, Natasha. Well, look, let's start on a positive note. I mean, if you're a producer, we've seen the Australian cattle market post some moderate increases throughout February. The National Young Cattle Indicator, it did climb to a peak of 362 cents per kilo in the third week of the month, but it has eased back just a little bit, and as of yesterday it was sitting at 352 cents a kilo, so still a pretty good number. Now, the real driving force for that support in cattle prices continues to be that export demand, and we're seeing that that robust demand, particularly out of the US. And it's dominated cattle industry news really kind of for the past 12 months. And it continues to be that mainstay, certainly in the first quarter of the 25 calendar year. Now, national export volume sat at just over 117,500 tonnes. And that's up 45% from January. And that's just for the month. So on a broad note, we're seeing Australian beef exports continue to consolidate, on that strong start, to the year, and in a familiar tale, the US, continues to be, that number one and has taken over 35,000 tonnes. But if we just quickly put a spotlight on other key markets, China showed good month-on-month growth of 42%. The tariff situation and that robust appetite for beef that we're seeing out of China, we're also forecasting that, potentially exports are going to lift for March. And also South Korea, a big market for us, that's up 11%. If we look on the processing front, really strong month again. Slaughter presently sitting 16% up from 2024 and a huge 47% up from 23. And we've heard that, some processors are actually taking on extra shifts to actually meet with the demand. For beef, one dark cloud on the horizon has been obviously the inclement weather, whether that is going to impact, that supply chain of getting animals, off farm to processors. If we look at sort of, lamb and mutton, the lamb markets have retained, remain relatively steady over the month. We've seen a slight dip in Feb, but it has recovered, a little bit as we've seen sort of rain over those eastern parts. National Trade Lamb Indicator sitting at 794 yesterday. So that's up over 28% on this time last year. If we look on the mutton side of the ledger, look, mutton slaughter's also been strong throughout February. We're looking at prices. I mean, mutton's looking pretty good. 415 cents a kilo as of yesterday. That's up around 9% from the end of January and just under 60%, on a year-on-year basis. And again, what we've said with lamb, we expect to see, some price support, over the next few months as supply starts to tighten. Processors now are, having to compete a little more for the availability of supply.
Fantastic. And you've touched on it here about the export reliance that we have on the US at the moment. US has introduced tariffs to other countries and are looking at introducing tariffs to Australia coming up. Has there been a market impact from those announcements already, and what do you think the likely longer term implications could be if Australia doesn't get an exemption for their beef and lamb exports into the US?
Well, I mean, the tariffs that Australia have got at the moment is obviously on steel and aluminium. So the agricultural sector is kind of on tenterhooks to see if, we actually get tariffs on beef and lamb. Certainly, we've seen the impact of tariffs in the grain markets. And while, Australia is not directly affected with tariffs, we are indirectly affected. And we've seen that market turmoil, grain prices, dipped sharply. There has been some recovery as Trump has walked back the tariffs on Canada and Mexico, but the impacts on China and the Chinese economy could indirectly have an impact, certainly on the grain markets for Australia. Now, if we're looking specifically at beef and lamb, look, at this point in time, as we said, there are no tariffs. If we try and look sort of a little bit wider on this, Currently, the US beef herd is at an all-time low. Demand is strong, and they've now got, looking at, placing tariffs on Mexican and Canadian beef. So it really puts Australia in a very favourable position that, as the number one, exporter to the US, we are meeting their demand. Now, like I say, the US herd is at an all-time low, and it's not like you can just, wave the magic wand and increase your herd. So this is going to take some time. Currently, from what the research that I've seen, the US is short about 3 million head just to meet the current demand. I guess we, look at what is the risk of Trump putting on tariffs on beef imports when they're short supply themselves. If it does go on, this is something that the market is really looking closely at. We're not seeing any sticker shock yet in the US on prices, but it will be interesting to see whether that comes. So, looking at the bigger picture, the supply, the demand dynamics of it, it would be difficult. Well, it's always very difficult to predict these things. But if tariffs are placed on, it will be interesting to see whether the impact of those tariffs is as great as people are first thinking. So I guess the takeaway message is everybody's watching this space very, very closely until we actually see some movement from the Trump administration.
Absolutely. And look, the other thing that people are watching at the moment, obviously, is the weather. Autumn has arrived and we're waiting for that autumn break. Why are the next couple of weeks so important when it comes to weather and beef and lamb?
Well, certainly we've seen, that in that southeast Queensland, so the New South Wales, the heavy rains, and that will sort of impact, potentially impact on the supply chains. But on the flip side of it, it's going to bring in, additional, soil moisture, which hopefully then, in the sort of the next few weeks will start to, progress into, better feed supplies. Certainly in Victoria, we're looking at the southwest. It's extremely dry. The next couple of weeks, there's no real rain on the horizon. So, the, sheep producers, dairy, certainly in that, that southwest Vic, we're expecting, that is going to, continue to impact, on those industries. And we're also seeing, sort of drier conditions come into, the sort of the southeast of, Victoria. And again, sort of that's impacting on dairy. And again, we're seeing those dry conditions persist, certainly in South Australia. So, we're really hoping that in the next few weeks we start to see, some rain come into the key producing areas.
Absolutely. Now we spoke, I suppose people are keeping an eye on the weather at the moment, an eye on what Trump's doing, an eye on the markets. But what will you be closely watching over the next month?
For me, it's going to be what is coming out of the US administration, whether there are further impacts on China, on Europe, what is going to happen with, Canada and Mexico, and of course keeping a very, very close eye and see what the rhetoric is, vis-a-vis, Australian exports to the US. So it's everybody's really on tenterhooks, but they will be the key focus points for me, in the next week or so.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on A+ News and giving us an update. And yeah, we will talk again soon. Thanks so much, Neil.
Natasha, my pleasure.